Hi, welcome back. It's lesson 42, and today I'm going to show you how to make a herringbone twill rug using bed linens from the thrift store. Mine is about 18.5 inches wide and 30 inches long, and I made it in 3 separate panels using the 12-inch long, 3/8 inch PEX tubing, which is equal to a US 17 needle. You could do it as all one piece if you wanted, with very long rods, but this way it's portable and you can make the sections individually. I like to use an odd number of sections, and each one of these panels took 2 hours to knit, and the background, or the strip for the knitting, is made with 3 different colors of bed sheets. Now, they were so close that you could barely tell the difference. So when you're doing that and you've ripped or sewn them, mix them up as you're working with them. But that way you guarantee yourself that you won't run out if one sheet is a little smaller than the others. So I made the burgundy 1¼ inch wide, and made my weaving strip, then this lavender is 2½ inches wide. And I just snipped them and tore them as I did in the last video. Now, I left the notch show of the weft on the front. I just used a bow tie join, but you can see around the edges and so forth, any place where I joined the weaving or the knitting strips, I just used bow tie joins. So if you don't like that look, be sure to sew them together using a bias joint, and if you look online you'll see how to do that. So I do not consider this rug reversible because I came up with a way of making my turns with the weft strip that would make the design as straight as possible. Otherwise, the weft wants to have a bit of a slant to it. You want to really show off the pattern of the herringbone itself. This is the back side. So you can see that the weft strip makes a jog. So I don't consider this a reversible rug. This is where I cast on. Make sure you do a firm cast on. This is where I cast off. I knit 1 row with just the knitting strip before I began the pattern, and I worked the pattern for 30 rows. Now, you can see that there's a little bit of a lift to my first row, and I think that's going to lay down as I use the rug. But next time I'm going to make a border. This is an example of what it would look like. I did this on rods. I just put it on this knitting needle to hold it. But this is the same fabric, the same size rod, and this is 5 rows of garter stitch first. And you know how to do garter stitch. 1 row front stitches, 1 row back stitches, and alternate that for as wide as you want it to be. This is 5 rows. And that will give you a rug that will lay down a little flatter on the floor. So you will need your 12-inch rods. Oh, and it just takes a short while to sew this up, and I'll show that at the very end. So the big thing is the turns, and that's what I'm going to show you. So you'll need to make the rug your rod stand 12 inches long, of any size really. If you want bigger rods, you'll need wider fabric. And of course you'll need to get a pattern for yourself online. And Joe is going to move the camera up and show you what that's going to look like. So you want to do a search for 2x2 herringbone twill. And weaving patterns will often look like this. You can use patterns from basketry or whatnot. And if you look at it at first glance, it's kind of dizzying, but recognize that there are columns here. And you can see that there is a rise and fall of both these tall, dark sections, which is your warp, and a rise and fall of your long, lighter colored rectangles, which in this case is your weft. And that design alternates every other column. So if you called this column 1, it repeats here at column 3 and column 5. And column 2 is the same as column 4 and column 6. So what I suggest, if you want to work from a pattern like this, unless you're doing the rug as one piece, if you're just doing it in panels, as I did, it's better to cut that apart and blow it up so it's easier to see. And then you can more easily knit from it. And remember, you have to start the pattern at the bottom when you're knitting from a chart. And so I already cast on using the crochet cast on from the last video and make it quite firm, and that way it will help to keep that front edge tight. And then I knit one row without putting my weaving strip in. And because this is just to show you the turns and how I manipulated the weaving strip, I just put on 4 stitches because that's really our focus today, since I showed you how to do it in the last video. And as I did in the last one, make sure that as you're knitting along that you make sure that your weaving strip is not too tight and not too loose. If it's too tight, as you knit along, it will draw the sides in. You don't want to do that. So, since I've knit one row, I'm on the left side, which means I want to begin my pattern on the left. Now, we're just going to do a few rows here in each of this, column 1 and column 2, so I can show you the turns. So, we're going to hang this up here so it's easier for you to see. Probably could even write this down from your... And we'll begin with this. This is the column 1, or this first column of the herringbone pattern. And it begins with this light colored segment, the square. So that represents 1 stitch of the weft, which in this case is our weaving strip. So if you want to, go ahead and make your first stitch. You're going to knit that, so front stitch it and pipe it. And now lay your weaving strip over. You can roll the edges in a little bit if you want to. I don't really. I'd pay more attention when it's a one-sided fabric like this. And put it between. Leave enough below there that you can sew in later to your piece. And you want to make sure, again, that the weaving strip is in the middle and your knitting strip is to the outside. So that covers your first stitch you made, and that makes 1 weft segment. And now you see that there are 2 dark segments, and those are your warps. So make 2 stitches. Now this pattern is a multiple of 4. So even though it shows 8 across here, we're only doing 4 for the stitch to just show you the turns. So there's my 2 warp stitches. Now, if I continued the pattern, I'd actually make 2 weft stitches, but we're halving it, if you will. So we're ending it here, just as it would be if we cut off 4 of the stitches, if you get my drift. I guess I could put a piece of paper up there, that would cover it, but this way you'll see. So now I only have 1 stitch remaining, and it's going to be the end of the row, and it's 1 of the weft stitches, and I've already made 2 anyway, so this has to come up and away, and I'll make 1, and I'll knit it with my knitting strip and bring this back down. Now that's the end of my row, and the beginning of my next row, row B, because I have to do that on the right side. I'm on the right pipe now, and the side of the work is facing me. Here's the end of my knitting strip. So I have to begin knitting on the right side of the pattern. And the last stitch for row A was 1 of the weft segments. So I know that that weft, or my weaving strip, belongs to the first row. And I want to put it underneath the knitting strip. In other words, I need to complete the last stitch of that row. Now the next thing I do for row B is 1 of the warp stitches. So I don't need the weaving strip forward to make that stitch. I want to just use the knitting strip. So I can leave this hang, but I want to make sure that it's underneath the knitting strip because, again, the pattern belongs to that row, if you will. And now I'm just going to go ahead and make 2 knitting stitches, or 2 warp stitches. And now I want to put this up. And now I'm down to my last stitch, and again I skipped half the pattern. I'm only using half the pattern, so I can jump to the end, and I know I was supposed to have 2 of these stitches showing, the weft stitch showing, so I have to make one more. Whoops. Yeah, one more. Okay, and now my weft stitch comes back forward. My weft strip comes back forward. So, this row ends with 2 of those, of the weft strips, and the next row, row C, begins with 1 segment of warp. So, turning it towards you, it's not going to look like anything because, again, I've taken this 8-stitch pattern and cut it in half. But I know that it ends with 2, row B ended with 2 weft strips. So it needs to be across the last 2 stitches. It's going to be underneath my knitting strip when I pick it up. Now, again, because my next row, C, begins with a warp showing, I can just let this hang. I'm going to knit 1. But now, the next 2 stitches are the weft segment. So I just take it now and bring it forward. So around and above, and make 2. And now the weft strip comes forward and down, and now I jump to the end, and what's my last stitch? It's a warp stitch showing. So I knit 1. Don't forget, after every row, to open up your knitting stand. It's not so imperative in this case, but you want to check every row, because you'll see, well, those are way too loose, you'll say to yourself. But you don't want to have them so tight that pulls your knitting in. Again, it's not going to really look like anything, so we'll only put on 4 stitches. So, we've done 3 rows. We ended with that warp stitch. So now, this next row, row D, begins with 2 of the weft strips. Now, we ended with a warp stitch showing, but we need to have 2 of the weft showing. So this time, be sure to take your knitting strip. You ended with a warp, so this time it can go above the strip, your weft above the knitting strip, and up and lay right there. Because we don't need that weft to show at the end of row C. So this time we go above the knitting strip and lay it right here, and now we knit 2. These are going to be covered by the weft, which is why it's up and away from us. Now bring the strip down and forward towards you. And now you jump to the end of the row. We end with 2 of those warp stitches showing, which is 2 knit stitches. And we'll do one more transition point, which is that end of row D, where we just ended with 2 warp. And we begin row A, so this repeats the pattern all over again with 1 weft stitch. So we want to make sure that our weaving strip is in position to cover that first strip, the first stitch of row A. So this time, just like in the last transition point from C to D, we want to make sure we bring this above our knitting strip and on top of the knitting, just like so. And we make 1, and now bring it forward, and this will cover our first stitch. And now we have 2 dark segments. That's our 2 knitting stitches. And now we bring this up and forward, and we jump to the end of the row, and we have 1 weaving strip showing. And now we bring this down. Now, row A ended with a weft strip showing. Row B, this is just like earlier, B begins with 2 of the warp stitch showing. So you want to make sure that you're completing the pattern, so you want to make sure that you finish the last row, which means pulling it around and underneath your knitting stitch, if you will. And that is how you would begin then row B. So we're going to, if you get my meaning, and you would start row B then, just as we did before, with the knitting strip below, or the weaving strip below your knitting strip, and then knitting your first 2. So that the knitting strip shows, the warp strips, the warp stitches. Now, I'm going to keep on going, because that was those turns for column 1. In column 2, the turns are a little different. So we're just pretending here. And we're just going to knit all the way over. And we're going to take a look at what happens in column 2. Now, again, it might be helpful if I did this. So, as in column 1, they show 8 stitches of the pattern, but really it's a multiple of 4. So if it makes more sense to look at it this way, you can see that this row ends with 1 of the warp stitch showing. So let's just take a piece of paper, just in case it's confusing. And I'm going to block off 4 of the stitches. See what I did here? And you can see that this pattern for the first 4 is the same as for the second 4. Well, let's just cover it. Find my paper clip that I lost on the floor. Where did that go? Oh, there it is. I don't want to confuse anybody. So, let's put that on there. Well, you know what? I really shouldn't do that either, because then you can't see the end. You'll just have to know that I did that, if that's confusing. Do you think that's confusing for people?
It was clear as a bell to me.
Alright, it's clear as a bell, Joe says, so we're going to leave it as we were. Alright, so, just remember that we're halving it, if that helps. I want you to be able to see that. Besides, you might be writing this down, in case you don't have a printer. That's one other reason I did that. Alright, so now let's do the turns for column 2. So, row A begins with a warp strip showing. So, we just knit 1. And now we need 2 of the weft strip showing. So bring it up. And the row ends, bring it forward, and the row ends with 1 of the warp strips showing. So you need to make that with your knitting strip. Now, we need 2 warp showing when we begin row B, because that's sitting on top of the end of row A. And so all you need to do is leave your weaving strip down and begin row B with 2 knit stitches. And now bring this up and jump to the end, and we need to end with 2 weft segments. So with the weft up and away, we knit 2. And then this comes back down. Now, in order to know what to do with this, we know that it needs to go below my knitting strip because we need to end it with the weft segment. And C also begins with 1 weft segment showing. So this time, take your weft, you have it underneath your knitting strip, and bring it around the knitting strip between the rods and just lay it up here, because it needs to be in position in order to cover that first knitting stitch. Knit 1, okay, bring it down to cover that first stitch, and now we make 2 with the warp segment showing, and bring the strip up and away, and jump here to the end. How does it end? It ends with 1 weft segment showing. Make 1, bring the weft down, so it needs to go underneath the knitting strip to complete the last row visually for the pattern. And then we want to begin row D. Well, D also begins with weft segments, so the strip has to come wrap around now, go between, and just lay it up here. And we make 2. Get in there, you. You can see that with these small rods, you're really gonna. There's 1, and there's 2. And now bring the weaving strip back down through the middle. And this is row D. It ends with 2 warp segments showing. There's 1 and 2. Okay, and then row A, that's your first 4 rows of the pattern, and it begins all over again. And row A begins with a warp. And just leave this down and make a stitch. And then to make your next segment, bring it up, and you make 2. And row A ends with 1 warp segment showing, and you bring it down. I hope that wasn't confusing, that I just cut that in half without actually drawing it out. I think you saw what I was doing. Because what I really wanted you to see was how, in these 2 different columns, there's a difference of how you wrap this depending on what stitches you're putting on top of the previous stitch. So as you work up the pattern on the edges. Now, to cast off, it's just like always. You just leave your weaving strip aside, and you are going to cast off loosely. We're just kind of pretending here so I can show you the next thing. So there's 1. Again, if you go back and you look at lesson 41, you'll see how I actually manipulate the weaving strip through the piece, but we're just goofing around here. Now, take this off, cast off. Make sure you're not doing this too tightly. Cast on. When you cast on firmly. It'll look better on the edge. And you have 1 stitch left. Get off there, you. Made these a little too tight. Now, you have 1 stitch that I just took off the rod, and this is where now you can pull your tail through. Now, pretending that that actually looked right, and of course it doesn't because I put column 2 on top of column 1. It's done in stockinette, so you know the back side will be your purl side and this will be your knit side. And when you stitch it together with your other half, now this was just column 1, and you can see that this is, in fact, let's look at that. When you look at column 1, and this is 8 stitches wide, begins and ends with a weft strip showing. This is 5 rows. And you want to make sure when you sew it to the next piece, you can actually pull this out of the way while you're sewing these together. But you want to, or you can weave it in first. It doesn't make any difference. But when you weave it in, you want to make sure you complete the pattern by wrapping it around this section, and then using a plastic needle, you want to weave it underneath those, just go in several inches there, and then it'll be underneath those. You could even use your finger. In fact, it's probably easier if you, I wove my pieces in after I had it sewed together, but it's just as easy if you do it first. So let's just use my hand here. I'll put it in here. When you weave it in a few inches, and then just take a needle and thread and tack it down to there with a few stitches. You want to make sure you have enough slack on there. And you'll do the same thing with the very first stitch of the row and bring it around the back. Might want to bring it this way. Don't put it into the blue, put it into the pink. And do the same thing. You can just use your fingers if you want to, or a crochet hook, it doesn't matter. And do the same thing. Try to get that flat so it doesn't make a big hump, if you know what I'm saying. And make sure that you have it up as part of the design. You know, this is not going to be perfect. You're using torn fabric strips. But you want to make sure that you at least complete the design and don't have an empty space there. And then again, on the back, where you wove it in, just tack it down and cut it off with a few stitches. If you don't have any matching thread, as you tear these, you're always going to have loose threads. Save a few. You know, put it on one of these doodahs, which I always forget what these are, but you know what I mean. It's not as strong as, you know, sewing thread, but it'll be good enough to make some stitches. And then when you sew it together, what I suggest is taking one of your, in this case, you're going to take your knitting strip, because you want to sew those together, and just make a slit and tear it in half and use half of it. And you want to make sure the key is getting your edges lined up. Use large safety pins at the top and bottom, and maybe a couple in between, and make sure you're trying to match up the design as best as you can. And then you're just going to take and whip stitch that by going in one side and coming up the other. Just like that. You want to make 2 stitches at the bottom and 2 at the top, and you want to go up, you want to catch each row best you can. And you're going to go back and forth, down and up. Now, at some points, you know, your weaving strip is going to be in the way, and you want to try to avoid that as much as you can. Just feel around in there. Now, that's knitting blasphemy, right? Because I'm not being perfect about where I put it in, or, you know, if you were knitting a garment with knitting needles, you know, we would be more careful about which stitch and where. But in this case, you want to make sure there's no gaps, or that you're not pulling it too tightly. You don't want your rug to pucker or draw in. But you want to try to avoid, you know, going over the top or even underneath where your weaving strip is, because you can pull it out of place in terms of the design. If you have to skip a little spot and move your weaving strip a bit, you can do that. You know, and you're going to have to feel around a bit with your needle. So you're going down one side, or you could do a mattress stitch. Doesn't matter. Now when you do it like that, you're going to be crossing your weaving strip. So make sure that you've, you know, pull it in such a way that you're not pulling too tight. You want to be firm enough, but you don't want gaps. And go all the way up. Like I say, of course this isn't going to match up at my end, but might want to pin it at the end first just to make sure it's all. Use quilting pins, by the way, when you do that. So enjoy your herringbone rug. Thanks for watching.